Now welcome to another edition of Let's Talk Some Star Wars, where this time we'll be taking a look at and discussing the results of the poll that asked, what is the best Star Wars movie of the Disney era? As usual, I'll then also be reading and responding to some of the comments left on the poll. And so let's right away get to the results, where we'll see that The Force Awakens got 5%, The Last Jedi got 2%, The Rise of Skywalker got 1%, Rogue One got 90% of the votes, and Solo ended up with 3%. Alright, and before even discussing the results or getting to the comments or anything else, I will say that yes, these results may be skewed or biased to some degree. I am obviously not the biggest fan of the sequels, and I do enjoy Rogue One quite a bit, and likely that is going to be reflected to some degree in my audience. In other words, if a very pro-sequel channel conducted the same poll, the results would probably be different to some degree. I'm sure the sequels would do at least a little bit better. I'm not saying I think they would beat Rogue One or even get close to Rogue One, but certainly if you took their results and mine and meshed them together, you'd probably get the more accurate representation of the whole fan base. That said, I really think this begins to show why we're getting Andor right now, why we're getting a show based off of Rogue One rather than any sort of show based off the sequel trilogy, why the sequels have more or less been ignored other than a few comics and a few books here and there. I'm not saying I think the sequels are going to be retconned eventually. I know we've had this discussion a lot before. I'm not opposed to the idea per se. I just don't think it's ever going to happen. I do think there are plenty of fans out there of them or people who just don't want to see them retconned, who would rather see them worked in somehow, some way, whether that be a Clone Wars style show eventually or I don't know, something. But I don't think they're ever going to get retconned. I don't think Disney would ever kind of wave the white flag, if you will, and surrender and say, yep, we screwed up, we're going to redo these. Unless they thought they could make a ton of money, which they probably could. Alright, and before getting to the comments, let me just once again say thank you to everybody who votes and comments on the polls or watches these or any of my videos. It is all greatly appreciated. And I do plan on doing more of these again. I know I haven't been doing a ton of videos lately in general. I know there is the Kenobi fanfiction series I started, and I do want to get back to that probably, hopefully, this coming week finally, and then to blitz the whole thing out and not have huge gaps in between. Also, if you do like this more kind of casual style video of just reading and responding to comments, and again, interacting with people is one of my favorite things about getting to do this. Anyway, if you like the style of video, I do have a second channel that I do with my wife where we really just kind of have a lot of fun and just have more, again, casual style videos. So do check that out if you're interested. Alright, and now let's kick off the comments as we always do with the top rated comment, which this time came to us from Adam N, who said, Rogue One. It fits well into the Star Wars lore we all know, but also works as its own story. I'm a seasoned Star Wars fan and saw it with someone who doesn't really know Star Wars. We both really liked it. And yeah, I think that's one of the best things about Rogue One, that it doesn't kind of require a degree in Star Wars lore to watch and appreciate. It's a pretty straightforward and simple story. It introduces all new characters. And as long as you have any inkling of what Star Wars is and kind of what happens in it, you're going to know what the Death Star is. I'm going to assume you're going to know who Darth Vader are. You don't need the degree to know those characters. Those are the ones pretty much everybody knows. And so yeah, to use a comic book term, it's a pretty nice jumping on point. It's easy to get into the franchise there if you don't want to just, I don't know, sit down and watch the original trilogy. That's probably the best way to get into it. But it's still a great way for someone who doesn't know much to watch it and maybe like, wow, this is really good. And Andor is kind of the same way, to get into Star Wars kind of slowly without having to worry about all these other characters and all these other things that, you know, you might not be familiar with. I think Andor is pretty much, again, a great jumping on point for Star Wars right now. Some people are going to call it slow and all those other things, but I kind of disagree with that. I love that it is slower, that it's taking its time. And I do think that kind of lets people get into the characters before they have to get into the entire world around them as well. Alright, our next comment then comes to us from Captain Pep, who said, I know people have their problems with Rogue One, but I still find it exceptionally good, especially for Disney Star Wars. And yeah, I have to agree. I think Rogue One is pretty easily the best of the Disney Star Wars films, yet it does still have some problems. Now, I don't know if it has as many problems as people always say it does. I think the weakest part of it is probably the characters. That's what everybody says. But I think it's more about the coming together of these characters. I know I've said this before. I talked about this in a review of Rogue One like a week ago. I think it's more about the coming together of the characters to accomplish something incredible. Not that that's an excuse for the characters maybe in and of themselves not being terrific, but it's more about the story. It's more about what people can accomplish when they are against impossible odds, but work together and have belief, have faith, and have hope. Okay, next up then we have this comment from Daryl Coles, who said, Rogue One is my favorite Star Wars movie since the original trilogy. It just felt so Star Wars for me, with a little extra grit, and what's not to love about the epic Battle of Scarif. And yeah, I absolutely agree about the Battle of Scarif. I think that looks incredible, both on ground and in space. In fact, the space battle looks about as good as anything we've ever seen in Star Wars. I always kind of hold the Battle of Andor in space as the holy grail, because even today, even 40 years later, I still think that looks absolutely incredible. But Scarif is right up there. If not, if we're being honest, probably a little better in some ways. As for Rogue One being your favorite movie since the original trilogy, that's of course all a matter of personal preference, and I don't disagree that it belongs in the same league or category as the original trilogy films. I think it is as good as they are, if you will. I think it kind of has that same feel. I love it, maybe not as much as I do love those original films because they have such a special place in my heart, if you will. But it certainly, again, belongs alongside them in the Star Wars pantheon, if you will. All right, moving on then, our next comment comes to us from Jacob Boschert. I'm probably pronouncing your name way wrong, and I apologize. I pronounce a lot of names wrong. Many Bothans died during the recording of Thor Skywalker videos, and so apologies to anyone whose name I mispronounced. But anyway, he said, if I watch it while ignoring the other two sequels, The Force Awakens is my favorite. If I take those into consideration as well, I'd say Rogue One, even though I'm really not a big fan of it aside from the last act. And I really think The Force Awakens is kind of killed by hindsight. I think when that film first came out that it was really popular. And not by everybody. I know it had people who didn't like it or who didn't like the mystery box approach or whatever else it might be. But I think especially casual fans and more non-fans, if you will, who just watch Star Wars whenever it comes out every blue moon, I think they really liked it. And I think most hardcore fans had a lot of hope after that film. I know I had quite a bit of hope. I wasn't like the biggest fan of The Force Awakens. I watched it and I thought, well, that's kind of exactly what I expected them to do, to kind of nostalgia trip us and to use Han Solo, and I'm really surprised they didn't use Luke more, but to kind of, use the old characters, use these old feelings and to get you hooked. And then, of course, we know what happens next. All right, our next comment then comes to us from Casper Nilsson, who said, in retrospect, I weirdly like The Last Jedi the most because of some of the good scenes in it. Kylo being unable to kill his mother is a really emotional point in the movie, and I like the Force link between Rey and Kylo. It's just that it led to a weird conclusion and spoils the rest of the story. But every other movie has just been Star Wars porn, which I find very boring and uninteresting. Give me something new, please. And though I don't know that I'd use that terminology, I do get what you're saying. A lot of Star Wars, and I'm looking at you, Book of Boba Fett, I'm looking at you, Obi-Wan Kenobi, it's all kind of surface level stuff, right? It's all like, look at this character, look how great it is to have them back, look how enjoyable it is just to be experiencing these feelings again when you watched it the first time, kind of like The Force Awakens did. And so I do agree that a lot of the Star Wars, it has been Star Wars porn. It's been kind of filler and fluff. It hasn't had a lot of substance. And I haven't watched The Last Jedi now in almost 5 years. It's hard to believe it's been 5 years since that film came out almost, or will be this December. No, I'm certainly not saying I'm going to watch it and enjoy it, but maybe I will watch it again in a couple months and do some sort of retrospect review where I'll probably just end up shredding it again, to be completely honest with you. But I don't know, maybe I'll give it another chance, see what I think of it, especially in hindsight again in comparison to things like Book of Boba Fett and the Obi-Wan Kenobi series. Our next comment then comes to us from Tucker's Baby, who said, 0% for The Rise of Skywalker does put a smile on my face. And yes, as you saw at the beginning, The Rise of Skywalker did end up at 1%, but for the longest time, after several thousand votes, it was still at 0%. And I do think deservedly so. I think that film is just such a mess. I'm not saying you can't like it. I'm not saying you can't enjoy it. I do actually get some weird enjoyment out of that film. It's just kind of fun and stupid to watch. I don't know if that's the best compliment you could ever give anything, but there is an element of fun while watching it, I guess. But in terms of like story and making sense for the lore, it's terrible. It's just, it tries to capitalize off nostalgia in a way I've never seen before. It makes The Force Awakens look like it doesn't even know what nostalgia is. And so I wasn't surprised to see that film just totally tank on this poll. Okay, our next comment then comes to us from MoFi, who said, the anthology films in general were pretty good. People sleep on Solo, but I thought it was quite enjoyable. And yeah, I also enjoy Solo quite a bit. I think I put it second behind Rogue One on this list. I think the biggest problem with Solo is it's, again, kind of heavy on the fan service. It's more that filler and fluff we were kind of talking about before, though it is still a fun ride. My biggest issue with Solo, I've said it before, I guess I'll say it again here, it's a checklist of Han Solo's like classic moments that we all know of. You know, Kessel Run, it's got meeting Chewie, it's got meeting Lando, it's got getting his DL-44 blaster, it's got him shooting somebody first. It just reads as a checklist, and if they had made it kind of based on one of those things perhaps, and not all of them, I think it's probably going to end up a much better film than what it does end up as. Moving on then, our next one comes to us from Padre Cosanero, who said, I know you want us to choose the best among them, but there should be an option for none of the above. And first of all, on YouTube polls, you do only get 5 options, so with there being 5 movies, I couldn't include that. And yes, there are times I do wish there were more than 5 options, because I think oftentimes in these polls, more choices obviously lead to a more nuanced answer or conclusion in the end. That said, I do know there are some fans who don't like any of them, so if that's the case, I guess pick the one that is the least bad in your opinion. Though I do believe most fans have at least one of these films that they probably enjoy. Again, I think Rogue One is enjoyed by most fans, or not hated by most fans at the very least. I think you could say that is the least bad if you're someone who has been completely unimpressed with Disney Star Wars, mainly because it just really adds something, whereas the other films have this bad habit of kind of changing things about the lore. Anyway, I think we'll then move on to a few final comments before wrapping this up, starting with this one from Siltrid, who said, Rogue One without contest. It's the only one who really gave me the feeling of a huge galaxy far, far away, and not a recycling of the same old planets. Morally gray protagonists, because a rebellion can't just be all rainbows and unicorns. Some original ideas, I especially like the use of the Hammerhead ships. And finally, the final scene with Vader. All of that rekindled my interest in Star Wars, despite the flaws in the movie. Then there's this one by SJFB, who said, in my opinion, Rogue One is the only movie that comes close to standing up alongside the original trilogy, and yes, I say that as a fan of the prequels. Then we have this comment from Earthbit, who said, Rogue One was so underrated when it first came out. I hoped that time would sweeten people's memories of it, and I'm glad I was right. In many ways, it felt like classic Star Wars brought back to life for a new generation. It successfully recaptured the magic behind the franchise I first felt as a kid, never feeling the need to go ludicrously over the top with space magic like some other movies did. And on top of that, it created a new iconic moment for cinematic history with the hallway scene. I've seen some people argue that Star Wars is a relic from a bygone era, that the world has moved on and the franchise will never be able to capture hearts like it once did. Rogue One proves it's far too early for predictions like that. And finally, we have this comment from Garrett, who said, Rogue One felt like the most Star Wars out of all the movies. I love how it leads into A New Hope, and I really like how it used original trilogy characters like Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, Tarkin, and Darth Vader. This movie handles the legacy characters better than most Disney Star Wars projects have. The only problem I have with the movie is that there are too many main characters. I hardly remember characters like Bodhi Rook and Baze Malbus because there wasn't enough time for them in the story. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. So now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think is the best Star Wars film in the Disney era, or what you think of what everybody has said here about their favorite film of the Star Wars Disney era, or what I said about any of these comments. Either way, take to the comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.